Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Whitney Delaney. I'm Associate Director of Marketing for Harvard Professional Development, and I'd like to thank you for spending your time with us here today to learn about a topic that continues to spread deeper into our workplaces and lives, artificial intelligence. A few just housekeeping things really quickly. We're going to record today's webinar and send that out to you all next week. It'll also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. There's going to be a Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So if you have questions, please add them at the bottom of Zoom into the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer those as well as the questions that you submitted when you registered. It's with my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today. He is a global thought leader at the intersection of business and technology, co-founder of Nexus Frontier Tech, the Circular Economy Alliance, and Exceller, co-author of The AI Republic, Building the Nexus Between Humans and Intelligent Automation, and a senior advisor to PwC, World Economic Forum, and national governments. He uses all of that expertise as an instructor here at Harvard Professional Development, teaching the programs Artificial Intelligence in Business, Creating Value in Machine Learning, and Growth Strategies, Identifying Opportunities in Market Trends. Everyone, welcome our speaker today, Dr. Mark Esposito.
Thank you very much, Whitney. I appreciate the introduction and very, very good morning, evening, afternoon to all of you. Also, glad to know that some of you might even join the program that I'm running in September here at Harvard. It's a hybrid, either in person or online. Artificial Intelligence in Business, Creating Value, Machine Learning, and other program I'm running. The other program is Growth Strategies, Identifying Opportunities and Market Trends, and dates in 2024 will be announced soon. And my colleague Jacqueline will actually help me now in running an activity where we're trying to capture from you what you think is going to be some of the most salient words. So Jacqueline, if I can ask for your help, I'm going to stop my share. If we can share the Mentimeter. Great. So I'm not sure whether you're familiar with Menti.com, but this is a great way for us to get some immediate input from you, a feedback. If you go to Menti.com and enter the code, I would like you to answer in any possible way that comes to your mind the question, what is artificial intelligence? I'm going to give you a few seconds. We have a large number of participants today, so at one point in time, we'll need to close it, but I see already a number of responses coming in. Love to have this eventually captured, right, by our conversations. So let's see what we have so far. I see infrastructure, human-like tech. This is happening live. Wow, now it's populating. Evolution, automation, progress, efficiency, lack of context, human-like. I see speed, statistic, trained data, future assistance is impressive. A few more seconds and then we'll be able to have, I think, a good picture where at least a good part of you have decided to answer. So a few more seconds and then we're going to close this. I think we can eventually bring it over to a closure. So yeah, let's maybe settle with this if that's possible. How many interesting things have you seen arising from that chart? If you follow some of the conversation that we were having, as I was mainly commenting on this, it shows you that you are clearly understanding artificial intelligence as multi-contextual, and there's so many sides to the story that needs to be addressed. So where this is really going to bring us is to try to unpack a little bit more about what AI can really do. And I think you already gave me a lot of really good inputs on where you think this is moving. Now, one thing that I think is important to discuss is that today, artificial intelligence is largely replicating what many of the traditional cognitive function were part of humans' jobs. And this is why I'm happy that we went from infrastructure, the understanding that AI is becoming part of an infrastructure reference that is different from how we used to generate value in the past, but equally more about data, training people. You understand the more managerial side of the story. you have been able to capture some of the conversation that are now relating to, are we training data when we are operating into open AI model like generative AI? So all of this, I think, shows a maturity from our audience that is great. So thanks for having done this. Now, how do we technically define AI? I think a good way for us to look at this is somehow, and allow me to be simplifying here. On one side, there is the autonomy. So there's a lot of tasks that are now complex, but they are automated and they do not necessarily require a lot of guidance because they can be trained. And we'll see more about the language of training moving forward. And then we see that the experience from the data makes it adaptable because we have more and more ability for the data to become versatile, learning from the use cases. So the more we are training the data set, the more the efficiency is becoming relevant. It brings me over to engage you one more time to start building on our foundation of the webinar today. So if we are thinking about autonomy and adaptivity, where do we see the direct application of AI moving forward? So if we move to our next slide, you notice that there is, first of all, there are 4 elements here: read and write, see and recognize, generate and navigate information, and speak and listen. But there is also Paul. I'd like you to tell me, what do you really think AI is most capable of performing? And so, Jacqueline, if you can help me one more time with the poll, you'll see something popping up, and that will be where I'd love for you to give us your sense of it. So which of the following abilities can AI perform? Please share some thinking with us. Great to see you participating. It makes the webinar, wherever you are around the world, much more interactive and part of the community building we want to have. So let's see. We have to say there is currently a winner. We see clearly that some of you are moving in the direction of all of the above. We then have a bit of a second position for generate and navigate information, and a bit less of responses on read and write, see, and speak and listen. Look, I think with, I would say 66% of you responding, we can bring this to a closure. I think is representative enough. Thank you for having shared this with us, Jacqueline. What the poll is really suggesting is that AI is capable of all of this at the same time. And this is absolutely true. We do see AI moving in the direction of capable of generating so many different outputs. So let's try to fundamentally summarize this in a way that can be useful for you. Let me move forward to our conversation. We are dealing with a multisensorial AI. In fact, the real answer is all of the above, and I'm happy that most of you indicated that. When we're dealing with multisensorial AI, we're dealing exactly with read and write. Think about the number of virtual assistants that we have right now around the world. We're thinking about see and recognize. Think about computer vision largely impacting from surveillance cameras all the way down to biometric information at the airport. I'm not sure whether you've been traveling around the world, but from US airports to airports in Asia, today biometrics are largely replacing passport controls or boarding into planes. And that's an example where we see this somehow becoming a replacement of what used to be a human activity in many ways. We see, especially with the hype around ChatGPT, that we're now generating and navigating information much more. The text analysis becoming rich, the search is also becoming rich, and we can even think about generative AI as a way of replacing search engines. And I know that many technology companies have been moving in the direction of directly competing with the search engine, namely Google. And of course, speak and listen. This is really where we have seen incredible improvements from the ability for us to use translators when we're traveling around the world, to the ability for us to have command directly to algorithm. Think about companies like Echo or Alexa or even Siri, right? As interfaces, they've largely created a space for us to interacting with machines. So all of this, ladies and gentlemen, really brings me to tell you we are in the presence of a multisensorial AI, which is capable of navigating so many different dimensions. Now, let me try to go a little bit deeper into the original idea of the poll. yes, AI is capable of being multisensorial, but there are even more interesting things that we are now discovering. Now, this came from a quite popular article on Forbes, and I think it was designed to be just a way of vocalizing in many ways the opportunities. You see AI these days moving more and more in the direction of even deeper application of senses. In fact, think about smelling or thinking about touching or thinking about, for example, understanding emotions. I'm sure you heard about robots in some parts of the world that are now being used for interfacing with elderly who are at home by themselves, and they might go into distress or they might go through health issues, and the robot is able to read their facial expression or how their muscles are basically contracting. All of this shows you a couple of things. Yes, the improvements are incredible, and we should recognize that. Also, what does it really mean to smell, touch, move, understand emotion when you're looking at somehow the translation into what it happens in terms of training the data? It is mainly transcription, it is mainly coding. So it's important to consider that artificial intelligence functions relatively well because it's advanced statistics and is able to largely integrate a number of different inputs in a way that generates the efficiency of the prediction, but it's not magic wand, so to say. There is a lot of statistical and computational power behind this. It's important because bear in mind that one of the effort we want to create in this webinar is the idea of demystifying AI. Now, moving forward, so when we talk about AI, what exactly do we talk about? Clearly, I think we have now defined the area. Most likely what some of you in the Menti mentioned as the infrastructure is really this multi-sensor reality that's coming live. Then we have more specifically machine learning. In the program that I'm teaching at Harvard, we actually have in the title, creating value with machine learning is really what happened when you're integrating algorithms and when you are integrating data. So when you are shifting to a data-driven organization that is using data as a way of defining tasks. And then you have, of course, a subset of machine learning, which is gaining more and more momentum. The breakthrough happened in 2010. And since then, we've seen significant billions of dollars moving in the research about deep learning. Is a subset of machine learning where we have in multi-layers a neural network. So in other words, we can better understand more and more what happens when we're dealing with phenomenon, like, for example, driving a car or in a more contextual environment, understanding the implications that are now capable of replacing more and more what would be a judgment that humans make. Now, more in specifics, when we're looking at the definition and category of AI, where are we right now? It's important that we bring this up to a point of reality. We're dealing with narrow AI in the sense that what we see today largely utilized is the ability for us to use, as I mentioned before, advanced statistics. When we are able to recognize a pattern, when we were able to predict and we were able to prescribe, we're fundamentally dealing with narrow AI. The reason why it's called narrow AI is because somehow the scope needs to be narrowly defined. And so the quality of the question we're asking the system to eventually elaborate is as important as what we basically say. So questions that are relatively good, they tend to have a very narrow and measurable goal. Questions that tend to be relatively poor are questions that are very broad. Now, what generative AI is doing, which is becoming available, is shifting the idea of AI to more topics. In fact, when you're trying your ChatGPT, I'm sure you've been trying different kinds of questions, make it more in what I would call AI as a service. So the degree of efficiency is not as high. I'm sure you found that some of your ChatGPT iteration, they do not necessarily have the higher level of efficiency, but it's impressive the ability for us to generate content so fast. But clearly, it is a problem with the accuracy that we will likely reduce, or in this case, improve, but reduce the flows as we keep on training the machines. And where is next? Well, we don't know whether we're going to get to something called superior AI, strong AI, singularity, the idea that AI is superior to humans. I think fundamentally we can say that from a computational perspective, AI is already superior to many humans, but I would say a calculator is even superior to most of us in doing calculus. That doesn't define human quality or human value. It's just that if you're narrowly define superiority in terms of computational power, for sure. The question is, and we'll see this towards the end of the webinar, are we capable of really thinking about AI largely taking or displacing significant chunks of our activities? And to that question, we'll have to look into this together, but likely not as much as we tend to fear, which is probably the good news. We have to understand the management side of AI, but we also should try to demystify on the fear mongering that sometimes is happening more and more these days. Now, moving forward, we definitely can see some direct application, and I'm going to run through this, but really brief for you to see when we're doing a program at Harvard, we kind of look at this as an ability for us to integrate into the strategic question. Well, how do we redesign our strategic propositions? How do we think about the value chain? So a big part of this, and I mentioned it before, is the speech technology. I think we're very, very advanced with this. Sometimes they're equally encapsulated into bots or chatbots. We now see many of them when we're calling a customer service, and we have to deal with an automated voice before we can get eventually to a human. Language processing technologies, we see this more and more from question answering to machine translation to web search to text classification. NLP have largely permeated so many different industries, probably one of the most, if not the largest, application we have about artificial intelligence. The next round of conversation goes into computer vision. I'm sure that you now can see a lot of application where we can see recognition of objects or even faces, from application where you can simply scan your credit card and it will automatically find the number and the expiry date, to, as I mentioned before, application where you're doing Face ID if you're using smartphones. That's an example where object recognition is becoming more and more popular and mainstream. Image classification, a lot of this happens with digital mapping. I'm sure that you are aware that GPS is a form of prediction. In fact, it tells you by what time you should arrive home or work or in maybe at the theater, and it shows you fundamentally that we've been able to use the geography, so mainly the topography of a geography, the road, the traffic. It's a very dynamic form of thinking about how do we classify images. And to take it even deeper, I'm sure that when you are intrigued about I would say self-driving or driverless, cars, well, what they fundamentally do, they do scene segmentation, so they're able to really understand more and more the autonomy of driving by taking into account multiple factors. All of this to take you to fundamentally, where is this going to take us moving forward? Well, it means that we are dealing with significant amount of data. The data is coming from either natural language processing, NLP, or computer vision. And what fundamentally means is that we will keep on seeing a number of applications of artificial intelligence. The first one, very common, is supervised learning. That's when we're labeling data. An example of this is when you're trying to get online and they ask you to recognize a hydrant, a bike, a bus. You're kind of doing labeling of the data, right? And it's a form of supervised learning because you are somehow generating a human input on a given thing, for example, an image. The next one, of course, is when you start looking at the machine capable of defining the pattern that are important for the question you're trying to answer, and that's really unsupervised learning. Is pretty much when the machine gain a degree of autonomy that is capable of running it on its own, and the level of efficiency is quite high. Think, for example, when your luggage goes through the airport and they get scanned for either object you're not supposed to bring on board or live animals, all of this is mainly unsupervised, right? So you just get like a red flag when there is something that is more of an anomaly, but is an unsupervised learning. And then, of course, the other popular one is the reinforced learning, where we're kind of interacting with machine through punishments, or when basically we're trying to get the machine to address some challenges, and then we have a relatively heavy human presence in making sure that we are reinforcing the learning more and more. So these are some of the most common forms of artificial intelligence application within the spectrum of machine learning. So you've been hearing this over again. Hopefully by now you understand in the context of the conversation that we're having, how do they really fit? And then moving to the next one, let me try to take you to an example. We've been talking about different kind of applications. We've been talking about different kind of reinforcement of learning. So let's take, for example, a credit card. Now you're using your credit card and that's fine, but it might happen that you just fly from Boston to Paris and you are not telling your credit card company you're flying overseas. You arrive in Paris and you decide to have a wonderful croissant and a cappuccino. You swipe in your card and suddenly the card doesn't work. What happens? Well, there is an anomaly. You used to be based in Boston. Now suddenly you're in Paris trying to get a croissant. So what happened is that you're sending the signal that your usual habit have changed. So now in small amounts, most likely the transaction will go through. But imagine instead of the croissant and cappuccino, something big, like maybe a luxury bag. Well, likely the credit card will not work at first. Why? Because different level of analysis, location, spending habit, and spending behavior will send a signal to the algorithm to say, there is a red flag, there is an anomaly. This user usually doesn't buy this item and it doesn't buy out of this location. These are example where by automating credit card fraud, we have a direct application of deep learning. And we see this more and more as we're interacting with algorithms that are largely managing some of our everyday transactions. Just to give you a sense that you might think AI is entirely far from us, but it's not that far. If you have ever found yourself in the same circumstance I just mentioned to you, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? The idea that suddenly we're dealing with an interface of artificial intelligence that is helping us to gain more efficiency moving forward. Now, how does it really work in terms of the requirements? There are a few things that we need to have when we're dealing with the desired outcome of having an AI-driven solution. The first one, of course, is the data. Without the data, we cannot necessarily generate the training for the algorithm. And it doesn't mean data being necessarily big. It just means that you have a high quality, reliable, and sometimes even small data that is enough to create the reliability of the outcome you're looking for. So it's more about the quality and the quantity, but it's really about having a culture on collecting the data. The next input, of course, is to having the system. Do we have the right engineering for basically building algorithms? And so I'm sure you heard a lot about Python. That's an example of a language used to program the systems, but it also requires a significant a new form of labor force that we do not necessarily have in traditional organizations, because we historically come from industrial model. Either we were manufacturing companies or when we became service company, the majority of company tend to be organized by either financing or accounting or services. And we were not necessarily integrating IT at the way we need them right now. I think it's a clear shift towards the needs we're going to have in moving forward. Then we have, of course, the computational power. Somehow slow connection, bandwidth, or access to a reliable hardware performance will, of course, largely diminish the outcome. And so one of the challenges we have about AI is how much of access to computational power do we have, and this is why the infrastructure is equally important than the programming and, of course, the data. And finally, and I heard it already before from me, are we really tapping on the talent required? So all of this question are a question that like whet a bit the appetite about what a course on AI really does when it's more on the managerial side. Is trying to get you to think in a very, I think, process-driven manner. Well, do we have access to the data? Do we have the right sort of like programming, or can we hire it externally? Do we have the infrastructure? And by the way, are we planning on integrating talent that is not necessarily going to be there only for the deployment of the AI solution, but largely will integrate my labor force? These are some of the questions that really are important for you to understand. But let me move you now, ladies and gentlemen, before we are getting to the Q&A, to what are some of the demystification we need to take into account. First of all, it's important to understand that AI is not magic, right? AI is fundamentally transcriptions. And when we think of transcription, we don't necessarily have understanding per se. It needs to be fundamentally determined in a different way. I'm going to show you an example. I'm sure you recognize what this officer is doing. And I'm sure you're recognizing that the second officer on the right-hand side is doing something very different. You as humans recognize this right away. The machine will struggle big time. The reason why the machine struggles is the machine doesn't have a way to understand the context. Now, there are a few things that I want to bring to your attention. Once humans are capable of understanding events without necessarily having to have a data-driven approach. I'm going to give you an example. A cloudy sky, for some of you might mean I'm going to take the umbrella. For some of you might say I'll take the risk. Somehow you're assessing multiple factors at the same time. Where are you going to go? Is it indoor, outdoor? If you're driving, you're taking public transportation. If you are fundamentally willing to take the risk, if you're not willing to carry an umbrella because it's actually cumbersome, all of these questions show you that you're using causal analysis. Now, the machine would not necessarily be able to do that because it will simply say, percentage of rain, 60%, you should actually carry an umbrella. So we have a degree of simplification, which is coming from binary systems that, of course, humans are much better at dealing with. And so moving to the next conversation, we came from more of a knowledge defined from human that was somehow replicating into some form of rule-based AI. We're now dealing with a deep transformation of statistical learning where we are building models. They're helping us to really deal with efficiency enhancement. And likely in the future, we'll move into contextual adaptation of what really will become an AI that is reflecting not only the multisensory reality, as we mentioned before, but equally more human-like interfacing, which still doesn't mean that we're replacing human. It just simply means that we are evolving in the way we're using technology, not just as a tool, but also as a way of enhancing our creation of value, which is really an important part to take into account. So how do I bring this over to closure before the most exciting part for me, which is the Q&A? Well, I like you to bear in mind that AI is not going to replace you per se, but AI is going to integrate itself as an infrastructure so that we'll need to understand how we make best use of it. Because we will likely find lots of people moving forward that will integrate AI as part of their skill sets. And so they likely are going to be the one that might threaten you at work. It's not necessarily AI per se, is the integration of AI into what we consider to be the next era of information economy, which is an economy based on, I would say, a seamless, hopefully helpful and human-like or human-centric integration of technology with humans. So avoiding this, thinking that it won't happen, is naive. But it also would be naive to think that we'll have a full replacement. It's more about the integration of technology into our life in a way that we can use technology like back in the days we use the calculator to make sure that we can use more time for more important things. So I'd like you to feel reassured about the fact that it's more about building the momentum for us to integrate our technology into our current labor force. At our program at Harvard, we are teaching you how to think strategically about this and how we are moving into a creation of value where technology like AI is integrated, but it's also a course that largely empowers you. And it's important that I tell you that. With that said, if I'm not mistaken, this will be the time where I look forward to moving back to you, Whitney, if you want to help me in the part of the conversation with our audience. Look forward to the Q&A, and it's been a pleasure to walk you through this journey, but we're not done yet. So Whitney, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. That was very enlightening and very interesting to hear. And we're going to keep it going with all the great questions we've gotten from our attendees, and more coming in. Everybody, please use the Q&A to add your questions in, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So the first question I have for you, Mark, is kind of like, where do you start? So if you're somebody who's kind of in charge of strategic decisions and guidance for your company, and you want to invest in AI and machine learning in this realm, where do you start looking at maybe areas for integration, and how do you kind of think about that analysis and maybe putting a proposal together to say, this is what we need? Where do you start?
Yeah, well, we think that's a great question. Whoever asked the question, thanks for this. In the course, I always tell them that culture, strategy, and technology, they follow this sequence. And culture is really the desire organization to understand that data largely transforms the way you operate because it suddenly generates access to information and measurability that is very different from traditional processes. Strategy means that technology doesn't have to be in a vacuum, but it has to be part of a strategic proposition. And technology is mainly how do I do this? So it's really start on how do you recognize internally in the organization the need for data and technology to become part of the culture. And that really changes, I think, the KPI. So it's much more of a management problem to start with rather than a technology one. We tend to see when they that once the culture, mainly the acceptance of the idea that technology is part of our firm and the strategy. So we have a clear direction on what kind of value we want to create. Technology adoption becomes the least of the problems. It really becomes more about how do we. So you can, of course, have a suite of options, but where we see a lot of resistance is when we jump into technology first, but we haven't really mitigated some of the cultural aspect that likely can push back. So that would be my starting point if that question was asked to me in a classroom.
Great, thank you. Um, so kind of, I think building off of that, what are maybe like a short-term and long-term like advantage and disadvantage to integrating AI into business strategy, or maybe a pitfall that people fall into when they're thinking about this or to be aware of as they're making these analyses?
Great. Thanks again. Great question. So one of the things that was a book that I written in 2019. It still serves as a textbook for our program called the iRepublic, and it comes from the work we did with my firm where we had a lot of clients. One of the major pitfall is that we tend to think that AI replaces a job, and we try to say, hold on a second, it's not the job you're replacing, it's the task, because you don't want to replace a job. You want to enhance a job by expanding it. And I think this is where I see a lot of flaws and pitfalls because we tend to use a really narrow economic mindset because we want to save costs. But we try to save costs at first, but eventually we increase costs moving forward because if you're depleting capacity, you have to find a way to integrate it back. So think in terms of tasks rather than jobs is not an easy conversation because many organizations, they are run by spreadsheets. They trying to ask the question, where do we save costs? And then there is an easy answer to that. But the answer is not that easy when you integrate in technology because you have to manage the integration technology within your labor force. That was, I would say, the most common one. There are other aspects, and maybe I'll mention it. When you're integrating technology, you're changing the firm. As a matter of fact, you're changing the factory floor, if you allow me the term first. Once you change the factory floor, you change the firm. When you change the firm, you change the industry. And when you change the industry, you change us, right? So that change, I would say, transformational journey is something that sometimes we take for granted. And it's everything but for granted. We have to redefine it. We have to rethink trust. There are many, many aspects that colleagues that are teaching leadership or management, they will be able to really cover as well, because you are fundamentally changing the DNA of how company are functioning, how they create value.
Great. There's a lot of questions coming in about kind of how do you trust the data? How do you know that what you're getting is accurate with, whether it's something like ChatGPT? How do you trust that what you're building and what the results that you're getting are actually accurate?
Yeah. So I'll start back from my example of credit card. What eventually defines the credit card use is that if it's me using the credit card, eventually it will be a person that has to approve the credit card being used overseas. Therefore, there is a human task that is delegated out of that. And so that's the answer. We do not replace humans. We simply empower them to really be able to assess and oversight many of these outputs, because somehow the output might be technically correct, but decontextualized, as we mentioned before. So that would be the first answer. The second answer is that data largely reflect an extension of the brain. If I think of something that defines my own mindset and it becomes my mental model, if that mental model becomes the algorithm and it becomes amplified by the process that I am putting in place, I'm kind of extending my mental model to a much larger audience. And so how do I mitigate biases? Goes back to organizational culture, is I integrate diversity so that at least the algorithm does not take into account only one specific kind of mental model, but we have some form of, I would say, collaborative mental model in place so that it tends to be more representative. We have a lot of conversation these days about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the question is, how do we make algorithm equally diverse, equitable, and inclusive? So it defines the quality of the input and how the input is coming from, where it's coming from, what is the assumption, then when you're doing the kind of, I would say, due diligence, the output tends to be better. It will never be perfect, and it's important that we are demystifying data. Is never going to be 100% perfect because it's just a representation of what we selected to be important to start with. But the more we are integrating on the auditing of the data, the more we're making sure that the output is not necessarily going to be too biased or too discriminatory. But it empowers, again, humans to make sure that that last mile, or what we call in our research, the golden mile, is still somehow delegated to humans rather than entirely to machines.
Makes total sense. Thank you. All right, question for you. What's the best way to motivate your boss to implement AI in the department you run? Or like, what would you say is a good kind of business argument? What would you say to somebody you had to kind of convince to make this investment?
Well, I would say, inevitably, this is going to continue to evolve because the benefit of having technologies like AI in the firm is something that we can no longer ignore. To the question, are we dealing with a hype? We're not. This is a something that is meant to stay. It will continue to grow. It will have different sort of like a ramification and application, but AI is part of our life right now. The question is, how do I make it in a way that is commensurate to my firm digital opportunity? And I'll try to be more specific. Sometimes we jump straight into AI and we think the AI is the solution, but maybe we don't really have a sound digital transformation strategy, right? We simply are still doing things on Excel, right? Or we're using analogic systems. So I would say to the person who asked the question, look into your digital transformation journey and see whether you have started. It might be that you need to start. You might need to turn process that used to be manual into digital. And that is the very beginning of having a data-driven culture. As we mentioned during the webinar, data is so important and vital to any form of training the algorithm. So how do we, create a data-driven organization? Is start from or recognizing what I call the low-hanging fruits in the organization. It doesn't have to be expensive or astronomical. It has to be within reach. That's the starting point. Like most transformation, sometimes we think about the outcome, but it starts from small steps. The small step really is about identifying what can you right now to digitally transform, because that's when data start coming in. And then likely you create an environment or an ecosystem for more questions to happen, which likely can become AI driven, but not immediately sometimes.
Thanks, Mark. Someone asked, what are the best ways to stay current on AI advancements and keep learning in this subject matter?
It's a great question. Again, all these are great questions. Look, I can tell you what I personally do. I mean, I read, from of course more technical publication to blogs or things like this. I tend to attend sometimes webinars or events where technology companies are showcasing. Today we have, I would say, a plethora of companies that are creating so many incredible solutions. I mean, even OpenAI, which is the company underneath or beyond, basically. ChatGPT used to be a startup, right? And he was silent and dormant for many years before he flourished and boomed. So I think there's a way to build a compass of looking at all these different trends and understand exactly what the industry is trying to pivot. Then I think it's really use cases. I mean, this is a great question because in our program, we do actually have use cases. We show some examples of companies that have integrated AI, and they don't have necessarily to be technology companies. From beverage companies, they're looking at AI to invent new recipes. To a medical company, they're using advanced scanning for example, detecting cancer. To educational company, they're using AI to calibrate learning according to the learner's experience. All of these are applications that we are really using in our showcase and the course, because fundamentally we want to expose people to ideas. And in the same way, we are hoping that we can sort of like teach them to get into the habit of looking for these use cases, they tend to be very useful to understand, not necessarily the replication of it, but more about the extension of what we can possibly envision today. Is also a way to determine it in a way that is more realistic rather than thinking it's too far away. It looks much closer because it's a simple application. And so there are many examples of that with him, but I really think it's building, I would say, a habit in capturing idea from different sources.
Right. Someone asked, and I'm sure several people are probably thinking it, if you're not currently working kind of in this area and you're wanting to pursue a career working with AI or machine learning, or maybe you know, working in something like marketing or HR and integrating that into your career, where do you invest? What kind of skills do you need? Do you need to know coding languages? Do you like what do you need to know if
Yeah.
this is what you want to work
So
in?
when I'll jump to the opportunity. The first thing you do is you take our course, right? You take our program at Harvard. That's, I would say, the starting point. But beside this, today there are so many opportunities to get trained, not necessarily just in program, but there are free courses. There are courses that are affordable, but there also are lots of free resources. So the question is not the access; it's more about the behavior behind this. The question is also about how do you start thinking of AI as a way of expanding your own job? And I'll try to give an example. So marketing used to be historically something that was about data and research and then market trends. And recently, digital marketing has largely become the most successful form of marketing. That has integrated skills that we didn't have before. Today, a digital marketer needs to know how to build a digital campaign, right? And he needs to have programs and software that do that. Similar, I think, is understanding that AI will likely integrate more and more function in the way we currently do things. I think following the generative AI boom, we're now going to have a mushrooming of a small company that will come into the market with so many different kind of tools. We will be able to see many of these applications every day's life. So question will also be, well, how do I now start integrating some of this into my own job? And later on, when I feel there is a gap, well, how do I close the gap by taking a course? So the answer to the question, Whitney, rather than having a quick, let's say, cheat sheet on that, it's more about building a behavioral approach where every time that you're getting short, you feel that you're running out of bandwidth, you're integrating knowledge in any other way you possibly can. And that's why I think AI today, but then tomorrow it could be something like quantum computing, is more about thinking of lifelong learning rather than thinking that once you have a specialization or a degree, you're good to go, right? I think this story is long gone.
Right. I know for me, I think that these are such great questions. And I saw several people kind of ask this of like, if you don't have technical skills, how do you add value here? And I think you kind of ended with that comment of, AI is not going to replace you, but you need to be able to have that vocabulary and understand where you can add value. So I think, that's a great comment. And just in general to everyone here, always be learning, always be making sure you're at least able to have a conversation and to know how you can think about these things, even if you're not going to technically implement them. It's great advice. Next question. I think I'm going to go for a kind of theoretical one, but I think is interesting that somebody asked, what is more bias, AI or humans?
Great question. And I'll answer, hopefully you don't find this controversial. AI is an extension of our brain. And so, of course, when AI runs the computation, mainly the algorithms are building outputs, right? We don't have any way to truly understand how they come to a specific output. So it's why it's called somehow the explainability of AI is a complex subject. It's also called a black box because we don't really know exactly how, we cannot trace a decision back, right? But I would say we are biased because bias is a part of the way the brain functions to make decisions. The problem is when our bias is becoming a digital algorithm that eventually becomes a digital solution that we're not challenged. I'm going to give an example with it. I think it's a great question. So one of the things I do during my program, I show a video where the video says, well, think of a pair of shoes. And everybody thinks of a pair of shoes, and I can think maybe of my favorite sneakers. But of course, depending on who you are, you're thinking about your pair of shoes differently. Let's say that I'm asking, for example, 10 people, and most of them tend to be gentlemen who think about the same pair of shoes, and less of them are, for example, ladies. If I have I would say, a poor representation of responses, let's say that 80% think of a pair of shoes as a pair of sneakers, and 20% thinks of a pair of shoes as high heels, the question is fine, because if I was asking more men than women, likely that is the answer. The problem becomes when the majority of the response, in this case men, they shape the rule. And now when we're thinking of a pair of shoes where the machine learning is trying to recognize a pair of shoes, only the pair of shoes that tends to be of the highest frequency coming from the data will be recognized as shoes rather than something else. That's a perfect problem of bias of representation. So I think it's really building a culture in organization where we are open to representing more views rather than less views before it's becoming a digital solution. So the short answer to your question, there's no difference between AI and humans. We are AI. It's just an extension of our brain.
Great answer. All right, so we have time for one more question, and I'm going to end it with this. In-house or out-of-house? Should people, how do you kind of make the decision and to build things internally and manage it internally, or hire an outside firm to work on your AI projects?
Great question. A great question to finish. So I would say it doesn't matter how you start. You can say the kickoff might be internal, the kickoff might be external consulting company, advisor company, tech company. So it doesn't matter. I think we have to figure out how do we get the ball rolling. The real question is, once you start, how do you build capacity internally for this to be managed as an organizational skill rather than having dependency from outside? So it's really more about rethinking our skill set or our labor force in light of the fact that this technology is not going to go away. And it's not like the old IT department that used to be on the -1 underground floor. It was remote sometime even from the organization, and it was kind of a detached unit. Today, technologies like the one we discussed in this webinar, they're becoming part of the strategy of firms. So how do you give it the right level of prominence? And so my short answer to that question is, it has to become an internal capability. How you start doesn't matter. And this is one of the things that we do in the program. We talk about, well, how do you start? There's an exercise that we do. The purpose for people to understand that it's not just an easy fix, right? You need to really invest largely in your people. And that's exactly what it is. You invest in your people who know how to use this technology. That's really the answer to that question, Whitney.
Fantastic. Well, this has been so insightful. Gives, I think, everybody a lot to think about moving forward. Mark, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and thoughts with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We hope to see some of you in Mark's upcoming AI program on September 25th. You'll get an email next week with the recording of this webinar. Follow us on LinkedIn to hear about other upcoming webinars we're doing and programs, as well as career tips and other advice from our other instructors, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for attending.
Bye-bye.